Hi there, everybody. If you've seen some of our webinars before, I am still Helena Carbon, and I am still the president of Just World Educational. A big welcome to everybody who is with us for this third session of our much needed webinar series on understanding Hamas and why that matters. My co-host here on this project is Rami G. Khouri, a valued board member at Just World Ed. Rami is a Palestinian Christian from Nazareth and a distinguished writer, author, and analyst who's been writing about the Palestine question since, I believe, 1968. He currently writes analytical pieces for the Arab Center Washington and serves as a distinguished public policy fellow at the Essam Faris Institute at the American University of Beirut. And our guest expert today is Jeroen, an accomplished researcher. Sorry, Jeroen, I keep stumbling over your name. I'll get it right one of these days. An accomplished teacher, researcher, and thinker who's on the faculty of King's College London, where I believe there's a lot going on these days, but we're not here really to talk about that. Back in 2010, Jeroen published a terrific book about Hamas, and he was one of the co-founders of the entire academic field of critical terrorism studies. It's good to have you with us, Rami and Jeroen.
It's very good to be with you. Thank you.
Thank you. Happy to be.
Well, Rami and I this is our third rodeo together, so we're getting the hang of it. By the way, you can learn more about Jeroen's book and his extensive list of other publications if you follow the links that our behind-the-scenes associate here, Mr. Mustafa Muhammad, has put into the chat box. I do urge you not to rush off immediately and try to follow all the links we'll be putting into the chat box, but to save it near the end of the webinar so you can peruse it more deeply at your leisure later. By the way, if you have any tech questions about today's webinar, please send them via the chat to Mustafa, who will answer them for you there. So today, I am not going to spring any pop quizzes on you, as I did in our last two webinars. Instead, before we dive into today's conversation, I just want to remind you that the multimedia records of all the 5 webinars in this series are being posted in a very speedy manner onto the online learning hub that we're creating for the project. And big thanks to Mustafa for his help in doing this. We have several ideas we're mulling over for making the learning hub optimally useful for the learning public. One of these ideas might be to make a written digest of the most important things we learn during the webinars from our experts, or to make a 30-minute video montage of the key insights that get shared during the webinars, or perhaps to make a series of fairly simple informational toolkit flyers, easy to download, print out, and share on topics like a brief history of Hamas, or 10 ways Hamas is different from ISIS, or the history of Hamas-PLO relations, or whatever, with those flyers containing links back to the more complex resources that we will have on the Learning Hub. Anyway, that's just to give you a general idea of the broader context for today's webinar, which will be one very valuable part of the broader project. And when you leave today's webinar, not that we want you to do that anytime soon, we'll be asking for your ideas on how to make the online learning hub optimally useful, and also asking if you might perhaps contribute either some intellectual labor or some financial support, or both, to help us bring these ideas to fruition. So now, without further ado, let's bring in Rami and Jeroen and get to the conversation. Over to you, Rami.
Thank you, Helena, and thank you to all who have joined us wherever you are around the world, and especially thanks to Jeroen for being our special guest today. We started this series not aiming to either advocate or to attack Hamas, but simply to understand better what it represents and to understand why that matters. That, you know, the situation in Gaza and Israel has resonated all over the world now. It's quite extraordinary, and it may impact the presidential election in the US and other things. So this is a a pretty big sticker item for the moment. And we need to understand who these people are on all sides. The Israeli government is equally complex, as are the American leaders. So, Jeroen, my first question to you is, why is it, why does it matter that we should understand Hamas? And what is the main point that you might make? I mean, there's many points we'll discuss, but the key thing to understand about Hamas, in your view, based on your studies, is what exactly? And then we'll get into the issue of critical terrorism studies, a field that you helped co-establish, and how that relates to Hamas. But go ahead.
Okay, well, thank you, Rami, and thank you for this invitation to talk about understanding Hamas. I think just starting with this question of why does it matter that we understand Hamas, I would start by saying that it matters because deliberate mis- and disinformation has been used to justify Israel's genocidal war on Gaza and its stated goal of eradicating Hamas at all costs. So if you just buy that uncritically, you're supporting the whole narrative that supports this extraordinary assault on Gaza and Gazan lives. It also, I think, it matters why this information sticks so easily. And I think particularly, I mean, people globally, but particularly people in the global north or in the west, know very little about Hamas, or indeed the details of what it's like to live under occupation for 57 years, which is only 6 months less than I'm old, and under an international blockade for 17 years. And for example, claims like the one that the Qassam fighters, the military wing of Hamas, had beheaded 40 babies were central to Israel's strategy of depicting Hamas, and by extension Gazans who had voted for Hamas, as subhuman and therefore not worthy of human rights. But I think the fact that these claims were accepted so readily and uncritically in Western media also show that Orientalist and Islamophobic prejudices, as well as anti-Arab sort of racism, are still very much alive and present. And so I think that's one of the reasons why this matters. I mean, it matters, for example, whether the Qassam fighters intended to kill civilians, including children. It matters whether Hamas are willing to make compromises and stick to those once the fighting stops. It also matters whether Hamas has grassroots support and would participate in elections. All these things matter, both for assessing what happened and looking to the future. And I would say also that sort of understanding Hamas matters because if you understand its relation with Palestinian society and other factions, other political factions, if you understand the history of ethnic cleansing, of dispossession, occupation, blockade, wars, etc., you know that eradicating Hamas would require a full genocide because a majority of Palestinians would support Hamas actions in spite of Israel's genocidal response. And we can get back to that later. Now, the Israeli government may not care about this at this stage, at least it doesn't seem to. And in fact, some factions appear to welcome the genocide as they appear to aim to erase the Palestinian population and claim the land for Israel. But for the international community, this should matter, even more so if the International Court of Justice rules that Israel's actions amount not just to plausible genocide, but to actual genocide. So I think that's just in short, sort of many ways in which it matters. Just two more things. I think it's also important to understand what has happened on the Israeli side. It's, for example, important where the Israeli armed forces killed a significant number of their own citizens on 7th October, as numerous reports and eyewitness accounts have argued, because that changes the narrative of what happened on 7th October. It matters whether or not Israel is taking every precaution to minimize civilian death in Gaza. And I would say at the moment, the number of civilians reported killed and the types of ammunition used in very dense neighborhoods suggest strongly that Israel does not. And then finally, I think Palestinian opinion matters. It matters what Palestinians themselves think. And I think a lot of the international debate is about what Israel or the US or the EU finds acceptable and what they intend for Palestinians. And I think this highlights how much of sort of colonial era attitudes still seem to resonate with political elites in the global north. And in this narrative, Palestinians are allowed to have their own state only if the government is made up of pliant technocrats that do Israel's and the US bidding. And this is patronizing a very colonial style logic, just as Hamas's violence must be understood as anti-colonial violence. And we'll probably return to this theme of sort of the colonial echoes later on.
Right. And just mention quickly in this context, you are a co-founder with others of a field of critical terrorism studies. And you said that your work on Hamas influenced this. What is the relationship of your work on Hamas to the field of critical terrorism studies? And what does that actually mean?
So critical terrorism studies was launched in the mid-2000s, really in response to 9/11 and sort of the turn to a sort of a terrorism narrative, where we felt that the term terrorism is analytically unhelpful. It doesn't actually explain very much, and politically it has disastrous consequences. And just to give a few examples, and they all kind of also apply to Hamas, and both in the current context, but also in the context of when I was studying Hamas in the late 90s and early 2000s. So terrorism strips the violence of its historical and political context. So it comes to be portrayed as coming out of nowhere, and it delegitimizes anyone who seeks to contextualize this violence as misguided at best, or a terrorist lover at worst. And remember the Israeli ambassador's anger at the statement by UN Secretary General Guterres that Hamas's violence did not come out of nowhere. And so that completely undermined the Israeli narrative that this was just evil people doing evil things, rather than there's a context to this, that there's a reason why Hamas does this. It doesn't condones the war crimes that were committed, but you need to understand that context, and we'll get back to that. Mm-hmm. Secondly, it means that there's no political solution. There's just a military or a surveillance policing solution. So this, for example, in the case of Israel, it enables it to deny any political overtures by Hamas as disingenuous, because terrorists cannot change within this paradigm. And it cuts out any possibility of resolving the conflict politically. So then you only have left a military solution, total eradication, which for a grassroots movement like Hamas, which has a lot of support, means having to commit genocide to kind of achieve that aim. And it's interesting that among those practicing sort of peace negotiations, it's well established that the term terrorism hinders the possibility of negotiations. For example, the Philippines government refused to label the Moro Islamic Liberation Front terrorist, even there was huge pressure from the US to do so, because they recognized that the military solution was impossible and that it needed to negotiate. And then one final thing, which I was sorry, Hannah, but I think terrorism reduces a very complex movement like Hamas to one dimension. It's all about violence, and this is also portrayed as illegitimate and barbaric. But as we know also from your previous podcasts, Hamas is not just about violence. It grew out of the Palestinian Muslim Brotherhood, which for long opposed resistance and was focused on welfare and preaching. Just participated in elections, etc. And also, I think what's important here is that it then elides the right to resist. Under sort of UN resolutions and international law, Palestinians have every right to resist occupation violently. It says in UN resolutions to resist occupation and fight for independence by any available means. Now, of course, this right is limited by obligations on fighters not to harm civilians, and any intentional targeting of civilians are war crimes. But the terrorism label reduces all violence to illegitimate and barbaric violence, even violence against Israeli soldiers. And this then serves not just the purpose of dehumanizing the other side, but also to obscure the barbarism of Israel's own armed forces in response. And this is, again, a colonial legacy. I mean, the British used this term in their colonies, for example, in India and Egypt, to delegitimize anti-colonial movements and any non-state actors deploying arms. And they also used it to legitimize their own, usually similarly extreme state violence against anti-colonial movements. And therefore, I think you need to see this also as part of a kind of a colonial echo that is happening here. So those are some of the insights that critical terrorism studies would bring to it.
I think that's really helpful, Jeroen. You know, I'm a little bit older than you. I actually grew up in England in the 1950s and 1960s, you know, in the era of decolonization, where freedom fighters from organizations like the Mau Mau were routinely, you know, dehumanized and demonized. I mean, I remember like being really scared of the Mau Mau, like from everything that people had told me. And then, you know, suddenly the British decide they can't hang on to Kenya, and suddenly there are people who are very close to the Mau Mau who, you know, are running the independent Kenyan government and shaking hands, you know, with the Queen and whatever. So it is a particular phenomenon of kind of late colonial violence, this dehumanization and deployment of the like accusations of terrorism. And just one other experience that I had that I think is relevant is the degree to which, when I first came here to the United States in 1982, the PLO was demonized and ostracized, you know, and there was reason, you know, they did deploy violence against athletes at the Munich Olympics in 1972. There were reasons to be concerned about the kind of violence that the PLO groups used. But finally, you know, thank God, they decided that the PLO had to be involved in the negotiations, and that, well, then we led to Oslo, and that made its own problems. But it is always a very politicized and specifically a colonial kind of label that is put onto people. So thanks for explicating that. So, well, you talked about the degree to which this labeling people as terrorists precludes or prevents negotiations and is often used specifically for that end. But as we've discussed here on the webinar series before, Hamas has been involved in several negotiations. I wonder if you could speak a little bit about the record of Hamas in negotiations, both like historically throughout the history of the movement with various different parties, but also currently. You know, I mean, currently we have a situation where our administration here in the United States is apparently trying to nail down a ceasefire and hostage release deal with Hamas at the same time that they express complete support for Israel's campaign to destroy Hamas. Well, maybe that's more a problem of the muddle in US foreign policy thinking, but tell us about the history of Hamas in negotiations.
Yeah, I think that's a very good question. I mean, Hamas has a long record of negotiating and coming to compromises and ceasefires. It did so, for example, in 1995, only a few years after it had been established. It negotiated with Fatah in the lead up to the 1996 Palestinian elections, which were the first under the Oslo Accords process. And they agreed to cease operations temporarily for sort of the latter half of 1995. It similarly negotiated a short-lived ceasefire in 2003 and then again in 2005 in the lead up to the second national election in 2006. And again, this was in negotiations with Fatah. And every war on Gaza since 2006, and there have been numerous ones, has ended with a negotiated ceasefire, negotiated indirectly between Hamas and Israel, and followed by a period of calm. There have been hostage negotiations before where hostages were exchanged. And since 2006, Hamas has also repeatedly sought to negotiate a national unity government with Fatah, making increasingly significant concessions, most notably in 2017. Although most of these negotiations failed for a variety of reasons, involving not just Hamas's, but also Fatah's intransigence and Israeli or Egyptian interference. But I want to sort of to give you one vignette of an interview I had with Ismail Abu Shanab, who was one of the top 3 leaders in Gaza in the 1990s. And he was a prime mover behind negotiating the ceasefire in 2003 before he was assassinated by Israel that year. And when I interviewed him back then, he told me that he'd learned to negotiate with Israelis in prison. And so it was the prison bloc that tried to improve the living circumstances where he was the leader of the negotiations, and he had to negotiate with Israeli guards. But tellingly, he also said that he learned there that the Israeli guards were only willing to accede to demands if they were pressured. So only when they went on strike, for example, did the guards concede anything, even if the demands concerned basic human rights. And so his lesson, and you can debate whether that's the right lesson, but it was that therefore you need violence to put pressure on, or the threat of violence to put pressure on Israel outside prison in order to get Israel to the negotiating table. But I think the other thing to say here is that so there's a huge reservoir of experience within Hamas. Even though internally negotiations have often been contested, particularly with the military wing, which is typically less conciliatory and more maximalist. But whether or not Hamas negotiates or is willing to compromise is very much influenced by the political opportunity and threat structure that prevails at the time. So in the late 2000s, for example, Hamas leaders engaged with Swiss negotiators and toned down their rhetoric, took some of the anti-Semitic references from their website, and dropped the decision to impose the hijab, the headscarf, in court, all through these negotiations. But at the time, pragmatists in Hamas, though they were weakened after their election win was boycotted, they still had influence. But if you fast forward, the rise of hardliners within Hamas over the last 5 years is in part because of the failure of these negotiations and the refusal of successive Israeli governments and Western governments to respond to Hamas's political overtures and engage it. And I think particularly the lack of response to its 2017 document of revised principles, and then to the originally non-violent Great March of Return, which originated outside Hamas, but which Hamas co-opted. So if political overtures do not lead to change, then that means that hardliners in the movement gain power. And one final point on negotiations is that what's really interesting, I think, since 7 October is that the center of gravity within Hamas has shifted. So after Yahya Sinwar's sort of leadership win in Gaza in 2017, gravity of leadership shifted gradually to Gaza, and certainly at the start of the war on Gaza, it was very Gaza-centric. Now, fast forward to sort of the latest negotiations. You can see that, for example, Haniyeh, the head of the political bureau, who was based in Qatar, he was flown over to Cairo in order to give his stamp of approval to the negotiations there. And what's important is that this external leadership, which resides abroad, have on the whole been more willing to accept a state on 1967 borders and come to compromises. And it's also important that members of this external leadership have indicated that the Qassam brigades could be disarmed if there were a permanent ceasefire and the end of a blockade and an actual Palestinian state. And particularly intriguing here is that this statement was made by Khalil Haya, who was part of the negotiations that ended the 2014 war on Gaza, and he's a member of the political bureau. And interesting again here, in terms of the colonial theme, is that he and others reference other colonial struggles, and particularly that anti-colonial movements usually lay down their arms and convert into political parties after they had won independence. So there's a very kind of clear, explicit placing what Hamas is doing at the moment in this kind of anti-colonial history.
Oh, that's fascinating. So in the current negotiations, first of all, I'm glad that you mentioned the Great March of Return, and I'm interested that you think that, I mean, I agree with you that the Great March of Return was like initiated as a project outside of Hamas, and you said it was then co-opted by Hamas. I think it's more like Hamas sort of adopted it. Well, maybe co-opt, adopt, it's all the same thing. But they gave support to it from the get-go, actually. You know, it could never have been organized with such breadth if Hamas had opposed it from the beginning. But
yeah, I think right, adopted is probably a better word. I wanted to kind of to make it slightly stronger because they're also, I think some of the military wing also abused the Great March of Return to introduce violence, which wasn't the original idea. So, but what's interesting is that if you look at the reports in B'Tselem, which is an Israeli human rights organization that documents the death in the conflict, the vast majority of people killed, and over 200 were killed in those about 18 months. Were killed unarmed. So it was very clear that it was in a majority still a non-violent response, and yet it didn't lead to anything. Right? So Hamas has tried wars, it has tried compromising with political overtures. Then there's this kind of this march, which is a non-violent expression of anti-colonial struggle, and none of it leads to anything. And that then sets the scene for the hardliners to come back in and say, well, we have to prepare for a dramatic violent explosion.
so just to nail down this issue of negotiations currently, do you see it as a possibility that there will be a negotiated ceasefire that will lead to real political gains, lead to the release of the hostages and to real political gains for the Palestinians?
I don't know. I wish it was the case, but I think it's interesting that Hamas, just before the invasion of Rafah, agreed to a version of the ceasefire, which clearly the Israelis didn't agree with, so it didn't lead to anything. But in that version, as far as we understand it, they did agree to ceasefire, to releasing the hostages in various stages. but all premised on a permanent ceasefire and a withdrawal of the Israeli occupation forces from Gaza. And so I think unless on the Israeli side there's a willingness to do that, I'm not sure what will happen, because at the moment you have an Israeli government which is the most right-wing in Israel's history, with a leader, Netanyahu, who's very much beholden to sort of the most extreme sort of right-wing voices in his cabinet, who are all pushing him to be more hardline, to eradicate Hamas, to erase Palestinians from Gaza altogether. So and that also, I mean, this is a particularly extreme government, but it also has to be said that in terms of Zionist ideology, this is very much a kind of logical outcome of that. I mean, the whole project of Zionism is to clear the land for a Jewish majority state. So I think it's too simplistic to just say this, to pin this on Netanyahu and the government. There's more at stake here, and unless that gets critiqued more bluntly within Israel, I'm not sure what will happen.
Okay. Let me jump in here and talk a bit about, or ask you a bit about the 7th of October attack. I mean, there's 1,000 people around the world speculating 1,000 different reasons why Hamas did this, and of course none of us know. But what you might be able to shed light on is, what does the October 7 attack tell you about how Hamas operates? They must have expected a huge reprisal, because they've been through this several times before and had thousands of people killed, a lot of destruction by Israeli attacks. So they knew there was going to be something big coming at them. What does that tell you about the way they think and take their actions? And link that to, if you could, the ongoing process whenever there is a process of re-establishing a legitimate Palestinian-led government in Gaza and all of Palestine. Does Hamas, do you think, expects to be part of that, or do they feel that they've alienated a lot of people have suffered and a lot of people have left? Does this hurt Hamas? Do they anticipate that? How do they think through these things?
So a lot of what I'll be saying is speculative, because there's so much that remains unknown or unclear or ambiguous or contested.
Well, join the club. We do that for a living, but as long as it's based on certain research, it's okay.
Good. But I think this will be a painful question for Hamas to answer in the face of this enormous suffering wrought on Gazans. But I think so there are various scenarios. I mean, even if Hamas only planned to kidnap a large number of soldiers, as was claimed in interviews with members in the newspaper Sharq al-Awsat, they would have known that Israel's response would have been more brutal than anything before, because before they would have kidnapped a few soldiers, but not a sort of a large number. But also, I feel that it seems that more was at stake already from the beginning, and from what has been said in public statements about the attacks being intended to change the whole political equation, and also based on analysis of what has been reported about the extent of the attacks, the number of people involved. Estimates range from 1,000 to 3,000 of sort of Hamas, Qassam fighters, but also 14 breakout points through Gaza's fence, spanning the full length of Gaza, from the very top to the very bottom. To me, that suggests that the goal must have been larger, that it was more than just a kidnapping operation. It was also about, in some ways, making the point that Israel was not invincible, that it was not sovereign on its own soil, that Gaza could take the fight to Israel. Also, an element of spreading terror, of killing entire communities. I mean, we've heard of testimonies from captured Hamas leaders that they say that they were instructed to kill anyone in sight. Of course, we don't know how much of that was genuine, what they wanted to say, how much of that was through torture, like in interrogation practices. So we don't know, but it seems that it was more than that. And I think if you look at how Hamas leaders have talked about wanting to change the equation, to show that Israel was not invincible, that Palestinians would not be forgotten in the context of regional normalization, and talk about annexing the West Bank, and to put Palestinian state back on the international agenda, it seems there was a more maximalist agenda. And this would require a shocking escalation of violence in order to kind of to change the the regional normalization agenda to put the Palestinian state back on the international agenda. And even if Hamas leaders only expanded the operation once they realized how weak the Israeli defense was, they would have known in that instance that Israel's response would be extremely violent. So, but then I think you need to put this in context. And there's three things I want to say. First, Hamas and Qassam leaders seem to have expected that the fighting would spread to multiple fronts, that there would be an uprising in the West Bank. They called repeatedly for a third intifada, that it would spread to the north with a much more full-on response from Hezbollah in Lebanon than has happened so far, that there would be more activity from Iran, from Shia militias in Iraq, from the Houthis in Yemen, and all of them have acted. They've carried out attacks in support of Hamas and the Palestinians. But these actions have been far more limited than Hamas appears to have expected, and they've also been very much constrained by domestic considerations. So it's possible that Hamas expected the Israeli response to be more diluted than it actually was. It's also possible that Hamas leaders expected the international community to put more pressure on Israel sooner. And here, I think the shocking nature of some of their own actions and the way Israel has succeeded in dehumanizing them in the eyes of northern governments and obscuring its own role in killing Israelis on 7 October and in helping to create conditions for the attacks, have played a role in the international community not responding more forcefully. But I think it's also an indictment of the international community that it has not upheld the much vaunted human rights order, and particularly in sharp contrast to the way it responded to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And here, a lot of Palestinians feel there's an element of racism going on, that Palestinian lives matter less than Ukrainian lives. And then finally, I would say that this, again, to understand Hamas's actions from an anti-colonial perspective, and they've talked about this, they've drawn parallels with other anti-colonial struggles, pointing out that millions of people have died in the course of liberation, for example, in Algeria and in Vietnam. And in their mind, the end goal of national liberation and a Palestinian state is worth the sacrifices made today. Now, many will disagree with this perspective, many of those who've lost family members. And yet, it's striking that in a poll only last month, so 7 months or so into the war on Gaza, 71% of Gazans polled said that Hamas's decision to attack was the correct one, and this was up from 57% a few months earlier. And I think this goes back to the destruction of Gazan life since its occupation in 1967, and in particular how life has become unbearable in Gaza following 17 years of international blockade. And if you think about 80% of people living under the poverty line, no viable economy, huge unemployment, 5,500 civilian deaths between 2008 and 2023, and the prospect that this horror would continue indefinitely in a region with normalized relations with Israel, so that it would just be forgotten and sort of locked into this horror. One could understand why Gazans might support Hamas's attacks, regardless of the violence meted out by Israel. And I think Israel's own extremity of response means that many Gazans lay the blame of genocide at Israel's feet and not at Hamas's.
Mm-hmm. And that brings up a related question about Hamas's relationship to the Palestinian people, whether in Gaza or all over Palestine. And it's a question that is rooted in a very frequent Western tradition of saying these are brutal dictators. They look what they did in Gaza when they had rule. They killed their opponents. They wouldn't let people speak freely, et cetera, et cetera. So their presentation as a brutal dictatorial organization is certainly anchored in some realities. They're not Western liberal democratic systems, but the nature of their brutality or their autocratic rule, let's just call it, does that cause a problem, do you think, for them going forward? Is this going to create roadblocks between them and anybody in the West or other places talking to them, saying, no, we can't talk to these people, they're very violent, and even some people bring up the comparison with ISIS. Of course, they're very different than ISIS, but how do you see that whole relationship of the nature of their exercise of power and their place in society and their interaction with foreign powers? And I mean, it's ironic, all the foreign powers that the US, for instance, in particular, demonized, and co-terrorists like the PLO, the Viet Cong, the Taliban, and others, they ended up negotiating with them. So what do you see in this realm for Hamas?
Well, I think, I mean, this also links back to your earlier question, which I realized I didn't answer, about how Hamas sees its own future role in politics. But I think you're right, there are two elements. There's Palestinian scene and there's the international scene. I think if you look at opinion polls, Hamas has enjoyed remarkably steady popular support over the years. It's gone up and down in polls, but and these polls are regarded as rigorous and accurate. But it typically has been between 20 to 35% of support, and very, very comparable to Fatah. But I think what's in some ways more important is whether Hamas acts in a more democratic or in a more authoritarian way depends very much on the political context. And when there was an active electoral process, elected Hamas representatives were generally more responsive to popular demands than a lot of Fatah representatives. In the lead up to the 2003 and 2005 ceasefires, Hamas leaders were seen consulting with the wider population about whether they would support the ceasefire, and they clearly cared about that. And the fact that a significant majority supported the ceasefire in opinion polls seemed to play a role in their decision. And it's also important to remember that when faced with national elections, Hamas adapted its program through consultation with its own grassroots and the wider population. And one reason it began to accept a de facto two-state solution around 2006 was because it recognized that this was the national consensus. And it's interesting when you compare this to the 1990s, when it won most of the professional and student union elections, but boycotted the national elections because it said it was part of the Oslo process, which they disagreed with, and they didn't believe that Arafat would give them a fair show. At that point, they faced a small, highly politicized pool of unionized voters who were more likely to oppose a two-state solution and support violence than the general population at the time. So they didn't have any need to adjust. There was no incentive. In 2006, by contrast, it faced the general population, which was much more in favor of a two-state solution and weary of violence, and it responded to that. And then you've got the aftermath of 2006. So this is the whole lead up to elections, and then the elections are not recognized. Fatah doesn't recognize them. International community doesn't recognize them. And then coupled to that, Fatah, encouraged by the US and other Western forces, prepares to stage a coup against Hamas. And that, I think, has completely changed, first of all, the incentive of participating in elections, because it means nothing, clearly. But also, it has made the movement much more paranoid and much more authoritarian. And since 2007, but when it violently ousted Fatah from Gaza in this kind of internecine struggle as a kind of preemptive coup against the expected coup, it has not brooked opposition in Gaza, and this is, of course, hugely problematic for Gazans. But I would say this is in large part a product of the breakdown of this electoral process and this internecine war between Hamas and Fatah, breeding paranoia on both sides. And so it is very much dependent on context. And I would also add to that, in the 1990s, before they came to power, they had developed a very extensive Islamic democratic framework for politics. That's one of the things I talked about in my interviews with them. Which also informed the internal decision-making up to a point. And a lot of the big decisions were done through a consultation within the movement, and so it wasn't imposed through an authoritarian kind of top-down decision. And this reservoir of political thought is still there, but it has been overshadowed by the blockade and the wars of the past 7 years, and the rise of this more hardline leadership. And so whether Hamas will return to that reservoir depends on what political system evolves in Palestine. And I would also say two more things. One is that Fatah itself is deeply authoritarian, but acceptable to the international community. And it was Fatah which cancelled the scheduled 2021 elections because it feared losing to Hamas. And yet the international community insists that Fatah, in some kind of reformed way, should govern. So clearly, authoritarianism itself is not a problem. It is whether or not you agree with the Israeli and American agenda. And that's what leads me to my final point. There's a very neo-colonial nature to this discourse about Hamas being dictatorial. You say they're not liberal Democrats. I would counter, liberal Democrats have been complicit in a lot of violence outside, right? Look at Iraq, look at Afghanistan. And neo-colonial, externally manufactured regime change in neither Iraq nor Afghanistan has worked because it was imposed from the outside by powers that wanted pliant technocrats rather than national politicians with a grassroots following. So I think it's very important to put it back on the Palestinians who have to decide to lead them. But any chance for a more democratic turn requires the establishment of an independent state and an end of occupation. And I think just as a footnote, I would reiterate what Khaled said last week, Khaled Khaloub, that Hamas has called for the release of Marwan Barouti, who's one of the most powerful Fatah leaders, but he's has been in prison since the early 2000s for his role in the Al-Aqsa Intifada. And Barouti has consistently come out on top in polls for presidential elections. And Hamas knows that releasing him would mean that it would not win the presidency. And similarly, Hamas has long indicated it doesn't want to govern on its own. At best, it wants a national unity government, or maybe leave it to others altogether. It certainly also wants to become part of the PLO, but not on terms of surrender, as Fatah has typically insisted.
Right.
Yeah, I just want to jump in. I gave a talk about Hamas recently at a church, and somebody said, well, why haven't they organized any elections since 2006? Which, obviously there was the plan for elections in 2021 that Fatah then aborted. So this person didn't really kind of know much about the history. But I think it's also worth recalling both that elections get held in a context. Too many people here in the West just think, oh, let's have an election, and that'll solve everything. No, election is always about something. The election in 2006 was about the Palestinian Legislative Council. It was about a whole lot of things, and you knew, what you were voting for. So I think that's important, that context. And when you mentioned, in the context of an end to the occupation, or in the context of a, significant lightening of the Israeli occupation on Gaza, or whatever, hopefully an end of the Israeli occupation under UN auspices, but let's keep our hopes high. Then you could have a free and fair election, and everybody would know what it is. But the other thing about elections is that they are risky. I mean, if you've been in a complex, militant, very oppressive situation, when you have an election, you reveal who your supporters are. You reveal, what your networks are in order to fight the election. And they took that risk in 2006 and got hammered for it, got locked up, even worse than they were locked up. So, I think it would be great to have elections. And I think, that we've got a lot of things that need to happen, including letting Marwan Barghouti and thousands of other Palestinian prisoners out of jail for free and fair elections to be held. But these are things that we can continue to work for. So, yeah, thanks for that. What you said.
Can I just jump in and add one little touch to this question again? The question of self-determination. Self-determination is a great phrase because it goes way back to the League of Nations, and it's maybe easier to use than, freedom or end of occupation or whatever. How does Hamas relate to self-determination? Do they use that phrase a lot, and what does it mean to them?
They have used it in interviews with me, for example, and they will say, where are you from? And you say, I'm from the Netherlands, and you say, oh, you remember the German occupation, and you want self-determination and resistance was justified. So they build on your own sort of background. But so in that sense, I think that there's a real thinking around. This is also linked, I think, to what Hezbollah has been saying in Lebanon. It's a very similar discourse that you get sovereignty. They often talk about sovereignty, but also self-determination through resistance. It's not sovereignty because the UN or the international community grants you sovereignty. It is you win sovereignty through resistance, and so that is very much baked into this. And it's interesting. I would very much recommend you read Somdeep Sen's book, Decolonizing Palestine, because there he looks at this tension between Hamas's anti-colonial side as a resistance movement and a post-colonial government in very restricted circumstances, but that where they have to kind of police the border with Israel and maintain calm, and there's these two things that are very much in tension with each other. But that is the anti-colonial element is very much about sovereignty and self-determination of the Palestinian people?
That was a great question, Rami. Thanks. So I want to actually pick up on when you were talking about anti-colonial violence a little earlier, Jeroen. You were talking about the Algerians, for example, who, routinely now when you talk to them, they talk about, oh, we had 1 million martyrs, but it was worth it. And just to note that I, a few years ago, actually, published a book called Inside the Battle of Algiers, which is the memoir by the woman, the Algerian woman who put the bomb in the milk bar, that, knowingly to inflict on the French settlers, the French civilian settlers in downtown Algiers, something, as she says in the memoir, something like the kind of pain that the French had been inflicting on the Algerians for 130 years by then. So I mean, it's not just Palestinians who make these, and she did it, Zahra Driff, at the instruction of her FLN commander, who had tried various other things in the Casbah. So it was part of a deliberate but much broader campaign. And the other thing that Zahra Driff was doing during that period was she was organizing the Algerian women in nonviolent, civil resistance networks. So it's not like an either or. Either you use violence or you do grassroots organizing. Sometimes movements of national liberation choose to use violence in a targeted way. And so anyway, that brings me to the question of women, which is one that I really want to explore more with you, because you said you had some very interesting experiences with the women grassroots networks of Hamas in the 1990s.
Yeah, so I interviewed a number of women that were associated with Hamas-affiliated charities, with the Muslim Sisters, which was the female counterpart to the Muslim Brotherhoods, but also student leaders of the Women's Islamic Bloc, which is Hamas's student wing at Islamic University. And one of the things I was interested in at the time was how Hamas treated women, and this was in part a very Western obsession. I mean, Islamists were then and still are always sort of interrogated on their attitude towards women. But it was also a very live debate within Palestinian society in the 1990s, with stories about Hamas forcing women to wear the hijab, and overall a kind of a more kind of conservative turn in society where more women were beginning to wear the hijab than historically had been, at least wearing the hijab for religious reasons rather than for sort of historical social reasons, and also being accused of imposing a very conservative patriarchal system. Now, one of the things that struck me was that all the Islamist women I talked to, and then including those who were Islamists but not Hamas, for example, Islamic Jihad or other sort of independent Islamist kind of groups, they said that Hamas had enabled them to go to universities, to enable them to get jobs. They were mostly from socially conservative families, mostly from refugee camps in Gaza. Over 70% of the population in Gaza, of course, are descendant from refugees from historic Palestine and now Israel. And those families would not have allowed their daughters to go to university if it did not have a strict segregation between genders or a strict Islamist ethos. Many of them also received grants from Hamas and support to become professionals. So they saw Hamas as emancipatory and going against Gaza's socially conservative culture, though within an Islamic framework. And it's interesting also that both Islamist and leftist women activists confirmed that Hamas was opposed to early marriage and to honor killings. And they said both of these were un-Islamic practices. They were kind of Arab cultural practices that had emerged and were not Islamic and therefore should not be sustained. And also interesting in that context, this was after my research, but in 2006, during the elections, the population group with the second highest percentage of Hamas voters at 47% were housewives, according to a PLC exit poll. But then I want to reiterate something that Khaled said last week, and that it's not useful to think of this in a binary way. Because on the one hand, Hamas is deeply patriarchal. Leaders regularly reiterated to me that the role of women was primarily to raise the new generation, and only after that has been taken care of, then women work or occupy public offices. Many of the leaders I spoke with said that the head of an Islamic state, if that ever came about, could not be a woman. They mentioned biological reasons, which I tried to kind of challenge them on, but they wouldn't be budged. And because they believe that God had sort of ordained men to lead, that somehow there was more reason in men, although I don't quite know where they get that idea from. But they had no problem with women being elected to parliament or heading ministries. And indeed, when they were elected, a number of Hamas MPs and later also ministers in Gaza were women. And there were also, and this was really interesting, a few voices who contradicted this narrative and said this within Hamas circles that a woman could lead an Islamic State. And one of these was Yusra Hamdan, who was the highest ranking woman in a political offshoot of Hamas, Hizb al-Khalas. And she explained to me that the hadith, the saying of the Prophet that is usually invoked to underpin the belief that women should not lead, and this is never shall a people prosper who make a woman their ruler, that this referred to a particular Persian ruler and was not intended as a general indictment of women as heads of state. And when I offered this interpretation to a group of rank and file Hamas members, the leader first said, he didn't believe this is not true, what does she know? But then the others rounded on him and said, are you a doctor, like the Doctora Yusra? Did you study Islamic law? No? Now then you have no ground for your objection. So if Doctora Yusra said this, it must be true. And this shows clearly that here education was regarded as a superior basis of authority and as the basis of authority, and not someone's gender. But then also comes to just show the complexity of this. When I interviewed the leaders of the women's Islamic bloc, these were also students, so they said that they pitied other women activists, as in their view, and this was of course partly their own kind of, they wanted to make me understand it in this way, that the other women were not given autonomy by their male counterparts. And this included, according to them, the leftist Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, or PFLP. And so they insisted that they had autonomy from the male leadership and were left to their own devices. And this was also something that the heads of women's charities told me, that they could do things without sort of Hamas oversight. Now, critics of Hamas disputed this and said that the women's Islamic bloc was, as they put it, run by the boys. And also what's interesting, that the Islamist female student leaders themselves subscribed to the view, for example, that women could not be head of state, and accepted that men, for example, had the right to marry 4 women, even though they hated the idea. We had a long discussion on this. So you can see this is not binary, right? It's not an easy binary, and it doesn't fit neatly into a Western perspective, which has these things in very kind of binary sort of blocks. And also on the leftist side, I would say it's not binary. I heard from multiple sources that leftists also imposed the hijab at certain junctures during the Intifada, in terms of respect for the dead and sort of other things, but also that women's rights were regularly subjugated to national rights by the leftists. And yet it was leftist women who led a public debate in the 1990s in Gaza about reforming the law to increase the rights of women. And these women also held discussion sessions with Hamas-affiliated women, including Yusra Hamdan, who I mentioned earlier. And they would discuss the works of Arab feminists like Fatima Mernissi, who said that the hijab was actually a contextual historical thing, which shouldn't be taken as a general rule. And so they had these discussions about this. Some Hamas leaders approved of this and actually also went and talked to them. Others decried these leftist activists as Western stooges, as trying to undermine Islam, and had a sort of very kind of misogynistic take on them. So this is not an easy kind of story to tell, because there's lots of complex threads in there, but it's certainly not one or the other.
Oh, that is so interesting. By the way, I want to just tell everybody attending here that we do have a couple of good questions in the Q&A box. And if you have a question, do pop it in the box soon, because we're going to be sorting through the questions and delivering them fairly soon. Just also to follow up with Jeroen about the women, I find that so interesting. It's quite a broad thing in the Palestinian national movement, in my experience, to definitely support having large families, because you have to, replace all those who have lost and whatever. And that obviously puts a lot of burden on women. And this is, people in the secular part of the nationalist movement, as well as the religious part. I would also just like one little vignette couple of vignettes that I had when I spent a couple of days with the Hamas women in Gaza, not nearly as long as you. You clearly got much kind of more deeply embedded with the people in Gaza. But I went with the Hamas women for a couple of days shortly after the election, and I got the chance to interview two of the newly elected Hamas women MPs, one of whom was Jamila Shenty, whom I was very, very impressed by her. I think she was the widow of Abdelaziz Rantisi.
Yes.
And I loved her because she kind of bustled into the office, you know, with papers falling out of her briefcase, and she was like in charge of all kinds of things, and she was a quintessential like working woman, and very much like in command of her environment. And then another thing I did was going. By the way, Jamila Shenty was killed by the Israelis, I think, back in November, maybe late October. And probably a targeted killing, as far as I can gather. One of the other things I did, I went with some Hamas women into one of their kindergartens, and I was literally blown away by the level of the pedagogy, you know, because I had this kind of idea that Muslim pedagogy for young children is all kind of rote learning and whatever. And they were doing interactive games and dances and little computer games and like PE sessions. And you know, it just looked like really good pedagogy for, you know, 4 and 5-year-olds. And I was impressed. So yeah, you have to like get those kind of experiences, and even more the kind of experiences that you had, Jeroen, rich, broad experiences to get big pictures of these movements. So moving along, we have a couple of questions here still. So the first one, and this is one that I think it's a great question. Well, I think they both are, but this one, how reliable are the various polls we read? And this is from Susan Scott. How reliable are the various polls we read about we read about that purport to survey the Palestinians both in Gaza and the West Bank? And how are those polls conducted? I mean, I have no idea how polls are conducted in Gaza in the current circumstances. So tell us more.
Yeah, I must say I don't know how they're doing it at the moment either, because it's the whole structure has broken down, and how would you navigate it? I don't. What I do know is that particularly the center that is run by Khalil Shikaki in the West Bank, the PSR, that is regarded as internationally very, very rigorous and reliable. And so over the years, it has kind of been shown to reflect public opinion to the extent that we know what public opinion is, but fairly well. What's interesting is that they didn't predict the win of Hamas in 2006, just as opinion polls didn't predict Trump's win or Brexit's win in the UK. So in that sense, I think they're in very good company. That it's very hard to because the margins are so small. But actually, what Hamas won was not that far off from what they predicted. And one of the interesting things there, I won't go into too much detail, is that Hamas was very strategic in placing candidates in districts. And for example, they would work out how many votes they had, and then if they had 5 possible seats, they would only put in 3 candidates if they thought that would concentrate the vote enough to beat Fatah. Whereas Fatah put in lots of candidates.
7 or 8, yeah. I mean, Fatah's election was, the way they fought it was chaotic.
Yeah. And so if you actually look at the difference between Hamas and Fatah in terms of the national vote, it's not that much. And so you can understand why this opinion poll didn't get it right, because it is a very small margin. But because Hamas played that very well, they got a landslide election because they concentrated their vote in a few candidates. But that's just to say that therefore there's a history of this being very reliable. What's of course what I don't know is how this has played out in Gaza at the moment. And I can imagine the earlier polls were still easier because you had sort of the southern part of Gaza, which was still operating. But particularly now, with so much of Gaza destroyed and so many people displaced. My guess is that they would do the same thing, but where they kind of they get a random sample from different areas. But you would have to kind of to rethink how you get that sample going, right? Because you don't quite know where the people are. You would probably get the UN and others to tell you how many roughly there are in a particular refugee camp, and then work from that basis.
Yeah, difficult. So a linked question here from Kenneth Brown, who asks, how widespread is Hamas in the West Bank? And how intense is their secrecy there in the West Bank in the face of Israeli oppression?
So Hamas has been suppressed in the West Bank since 2007, both by Israel and by Fatah. In that sense, it is a much weaker organization, or has become much weaker in the West Bank. What's interesting, though, is that support for Hamas since 7 October in the West Bank has just shot up. I remember I think it was the December poll that it had tripled within those 2-3 months. And I think, I mean, this was also, I think, part of the logic behind Hamas's attack, that they felt that the Palestinian Authority in Ramallah wasn't actually governing Palestine in the interest of Palestinians, that they'd become sort of a security force for the Israelis to keep the calm. And a lot of Palestinians on the ground felt the same. And then particularly when the Palestinian Authority started to clamp down on pro-Gaza protests in the West Bank, then of course it just undermined its own legitimacy even further. So you've seen a huge drop in support for Fatah in the West Bank, and a huge increase in support for Hamas. But Hamas doesn't have the kind of infrastructure to in some ways to build on that effectively, because it would have to come to rebuild itself, and Fatah would not allow that, at least under the present circumstances.
Interesting. So we have a question from Catherine Habib, who's asking, how does Hamas relate to Muslim religious leaders, and what influence does that Muslim leadership have on Hamas?
They respect them. They will go to international conferences, but I think they're very much their own party. I remember in the 1990s when I was talking, for example, to Ismail Abu Shanab, who I talked about earlier, because he was one of the frankest, most accessible Hamas leaders in terms of he would sort of talk about his logic and his thinking, and he said. And as well, I think very, very revealing. If I, Abu Shanab, come up with a policy, it's just me, Abu Shanab, and people have to take my word for it. If I can find a religious leader who supports what I say, if I see, for example, Rashid Ghannouchi, or one of the regional figures. I mean, Ghannouchi is complicated because he's both political and religious, but Qaradawi in Qatar, a Muslim Brothers of thinker, then they would take the words from that thinker to support what they already had decided they wanted to do. So, for example, when they started suicide operations, or what they call martyrdom operations, or self-martyrdom operations, they didn't have a fatwa, or a religious edict, kind of to justify that, but they felt from a military perspective that this was the kind of the next step to do, which they had learned from Hezbollah when they were kind of exiled to Lebanon for a number of months by Israel. But then they found somebody like Qaradawi afterwards, then gave it a fatwa that justified it. So in that sense, I think Hamas is very much its own party, and then sort of finds the right religious ruling to go with it.
So then they kind of go shopping for the right sheikh who will give them what they want.
Yeah, and
but that's very different actually from the situation, for example, in the Islamic Republic of Iran, where the religious leaders are tightly in control of just about everything at the leadership level. Is that right?
Yeah. And when I talked with Hamas leaders about Iran, they were very scathing about that, because they said in our Islamic State we wouldn't have this kind of this council of ulama, of religious leaders, who would dictate everything. They wanted to have religious leaders in the parliament, but as elected. And it was very interesting. They made a distinction between religious authority and elected authority. And they said Islamic law, the revealed laws in the Quran and etc., are not legal until they've been legislated upon by the elected assembly. Before that, they're religious laws, but they're not politically kind of legal. And so, in that sense, they're a very political organization. Where I mean, religion has I think come to play a larger part since the 1990s, and it's very interesting that Yassin very self-consciously sent cohort after cohort of Hamas members to Saudi Arabia to get sort of the proper credentials to become imams and religious leaders, and then they would come home and sort of and run the Awqaf ministry, you know, so the religious endowments and etc. So he built a whole cadre of formally trained religious leaders. Whereas when Hamas started out, or before that, the Muslim Brotherhood restarted in the 1970s, they were mostly lay preachers, right? They were engineers, they were teachers, they were doctors, and then they would preach in the mosque, but they were not religious leaders. And so that relationship between politics and religion in Hamas is a very interesting one.
So he sent them to Saudi Arabia. He didn't send them to Qatar.
Most of them went to Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, because I mean, my impression is that Qatar, the Muslim Brotherhood is very influential in Qatar.
Yeah, so this was, of course, an early period when Saudi Arabia turned against the Muslim Brotherhood. Then it would have gone somewhere else. But the foundation was sort of laid in the late 80s, early 90s for this new leadership. And then when Yassin was assassinated, up to because he had this kind of this role. He was not.
Remind me, he was assassinated in 2001.
2004.
Yeah.
A year after Abu Shanab and only a few weeks before Abdulaziz Rantisi. But he wasn't a religiously trained leader, but he had this enormous charismatics of religious authority, and so that meant that we're doing a study on this, thinking about this as a prophetic mode of authority in a Bourdieusian sense. But what's interesting there is that is kind of an extraordinary type of authority, which is not it's not institutionalized, and you can't pass it on to somebody because it's very much personal. So you can see that he was preparing the ground for when he was killed or died, that there would be this institutionalized class that could take over. But they never achieved that same kind of dominance, of course, as Yassin in the movement, because they were not the founder. They didn't have this charisma. But some of those clerics did become members of the political bureau and did gain sort of more positions than they had before. But still, as far as I understand the research around this, sort of going now into the 2010s, and religious authority is still sublimated to political authority, right? So it's always the political reasoning wins out over the religious on the whole. I mean, there are, of course, exceptions in extreme case, but that seems to be the case.
Wow. That was a great question. I'm really glad to have had that answer. I'm afraid we're actually getting close to the time because Rami has another thing to go to, and I know that a lot of people who are watching this. So we do have other questions, and we'll try to get back to the other questions maybe next time, or we can do it offline at some point. But I just really want to take this chance to thank you very much, Jeroen. I mean, the depth of your experience and like your analytical skills, and I love your critical terrorism approach to all of this. I mean, I think it fits very well with the kind of anti-colonial commitments that we have here at Just World Educational. So thank you for bringing that so richly to our webinar today.
Very welcome.
Also, keep in mind that we're going to take all the knowledge that comes out of these 5 seminars and somehow distill them. We're not sure exactly how, in video and text, and make it widely available, because this is such a huge issue around the world, which is discussed with such little factual knowledge in most cases. There's very few people around the world who talk about Hamas the way that you and others who have actually spent time with them and studied them and understand them without joining them. Thank you for sharing your knowledge with us, and we will share it with the world.
Yeah, and thank you, Rami, for being a super co-host and co-pilot on this project, which we kind of we put the plane into the air, and we're designing the plane as we fly it. But it's been flying pretty well, I want to say. And Jeroen and our earlier guests, have both really contributed. I want to tell you a few things just before I sign off. First is, when people leave the webinar, you should be sent to an evaluation form, and we really value your evaluation because that helps us design the whole project and the whole program going forward. Next week, we're going to have our guest expert will be Moeen Rabbani, a Dutch Palestinian. I don't know what's with the Dutch in this project, but here we are, who is a co-editor of Al Jadaliyya and a non-resident fellow with the Doha-based Center for Conflict and Humanitarian Studies. So we'll look forward to another great webinar on that occasion. Just want to remind everybody that Just World Educational offers our programs free of charge to the learning public, but of course we have expenses and we need to rely on your generosity to cover our costs. Thank you everybody for being with us today. Hope to see you same time, same place next week. Bye-bye then.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.